Webb, welcome to the Global E-commerce Leaders Podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Well, thanks so much for joining us. It's great to see you. Where are we finding you today?
I'm in Austin, Texas today. Thanks for having me.
Love Austin, Texas. You and I were chatting a little bit about some great barbecue in those parts. So you're making me nostalgic or making me hungry. One of those two things. Welcome, like I said, to the podcast. Let's start. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You got a great background, lots of experience, and now you've wound up at leadership position there at Swap, and we'll talk about Swap as well. But first, who are you and what do you do for a living?
Yeah, we were talking about the barbecue scene here. I actually went to high school about 30 minutes north of here. But professionally, I've spent basically my entire career working with or at high growth technology companies. I've done that from a bunch of vantages: investor, advisor, board member, and probably the majority of the time now as an operator. Early on the operating side, was at Avalara, then Qualtrics, all these high growth places. But the compliance side early on, watched a lot of brands leave international money on the table. And ultimately, we're doing that because the plumbing and the mechanics of getting this done was too hard. Saw Swap as an answer to that, and just really had wished it had existed years ago when I was spending way more time on the e-com side of the world. So really excited to be talking to you guys a little bit more about Swap.
Well, now let's talk about Swap. There's with someone of your background and caliber, you probably would have a lot of choices about where you would hang your hat, so to speak. Talking about Texas, what drove you to choose Swap amongst all the other choices that you had, and what's new and interesting, and what makes them as an organization remarkable?
I got really inspired by the mission here. Swap is delivering innovation to merchants and trying to do that in a way where we're keeping commerce open and merchant controlled, right? And so I'm always looking for companies that I'm going to spend time with, not just write a check-in, but spend time with, that are trying to do something that's sufficiently audacious, right? Are we changing the way the world works, or are we changing the way a big market works? And the Swap founders here found themselves, right, intentionally or by luck, working in the intersection of logistics and commerce, right? Two of the largest markets. So we're checking all of those boxes, and then the rest of it is really all about fit. Are there things that I could bring to the table to be really helpful? As much as I've spent a lot of time on the operating side, I've never been a co-founder. I've only ever been a co-conspirator, right, with founders at sort of the scale up stage, joining somebody else's band. And this is one that looks really, really special to me.
Now, scope and scale wise, you just set up shop, so to speak, in Austin. But how many of you are there? Is that your head office? Or do you have other offices? Just give us a sense of scope and scale at this point in your evolution.
Company is growing like a rocket, but is very young. We are just over 4 years. I think we've crossed our 4-year mark now. Headquartered originally out of London. We started last year with a couple employees in New York. We're at north of 50 employees in New York City now. And this year we started with no presence in Texas. I actually moved from Seattle to Austin to help us open the space. We just got the wonderful wallpaper up here, decorations done and everything. We're north of 40 people.
Wow.
Here in the Austin office now.
That's fast. It's good to have someone who's used to scaling. Jim, over to you.
Yeah, no, Webb, again, great to have you on, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about Swap and what makes Swap, so unique. Thank you for sharing the Swap mission. And I do I want to come back to that merchant control, part of the mission, because I've written about that, in numerous kind of global studies, that we've done. But for anyone, hearing about Swap for the first time, how do you describe, what you're building? What are you delivering, to those merchants? And what are the key differentiated benefits to those same merchants that are going global?
Yeah, we are letting brands sell anywhere in the world, and increasingly we're letting them do that to anyone, which is not just humans but also agents, right? We're really trying to look at this from an e-com workflow, all the way from discovery, right, finding your brand, finding your products, to delivery at the doorstep, and then after for things like returns. And we're really, at the end of the day, trying to help merchants grow revenue, grow profit, and grow a really successful long-term customer relationship. And from a differentiation standpoint, I was mentioned it earlier. There used to be such an intimidation factor for, at least for this topic, right? Going global, and I think there's still a lot of buzzword and intimidation around agentic. Hey, I go use something, but how do I start incorporating that in my business in a real way? You don't have to be a big company anymore to get the big benefits, right? Like, let's take duty reclaim as an example, right? There used to be a big bond, you still do, right? You got to put the bond up, right? You got to know what you're doing, paperwork you got to keep track of. And now we've just taken that all off the table, right? With Swap, we can just turn that on for you. We can even turn it on for you retroactively if you've been with us for a while, not using those kind of things that are compliance like language and jargon, but is just found money, right? Like, we're directly impacting profit. And we can do that for the little guy competing on a global scale.
Why is it, in your opinion, Webb, that we've seen over the years where the U.S. merchants are sometimes a little, I'll say baffled, by the global opportunity, and yet when we've done, work, especially considering, that swap started in the UK, right? We've done, big global studies for Mastercard over the years, comparing cross-border e-commerce from U.S. merchants versus UK merchants, and the differences were quite startling, right? I mean, the UK merchants clearly thought global right out of the gates, where it was almost an add-on, kind of bolt-on module for a lot of the US merchants. Why do you think that this is happening? Why do US based brands tend to overlook international as this great growth driver for the company overall?
Yeah, Jim, it's a good question. I think the common answer that people give here is, well, the U.S. is just a big market, so why bother? And I think that's a miss, right? Like, brands don't skip international because there's no demand, right? They're skipping it because of the operational overhead fear. Swap really embedded in that mission statement is, we're really trying to remove that fear, right? There is no, this is a solved problem with technology, and you should go with gusto, right? There should be no fear. We can get you live, selling internationally, pick one market, let's do it in 30 days.
And as I understand with your business model, the merchants retain their merchant of record status, when it comes to moving their goods, across, into international territories. Tell us a little bit about that. Is that kind of a key component of that merchant control that you want to clearly enable them with?
I think the control part really matters. I think the mechanics of merchant of record, seller of record, importer of record, right? You don't need to understand these things anymore. They shouldn't be critical to your business. And with the legacy tools, what you were really doing almost since the dawn of time to commerce is the same as today, where you had to resell to someone else to then get it to your final customer. With Swap, the customer is yours, the cash is yours, the data is yours, right? You own it end to end. And we think about that really through the 3 C's here: control, cash, and customer ownership. All of that embedded with the data underpinning it, right? That's the control piece that matters. And so the mechanisms of these Incoterms of language, right? Those aren't the part that really matter, right? The part that matters is that you're allowed to maintain the relationship with your customer, maintain your data, and then at the end of the day, maintain control.
Webb, you mentioned agentic. It's not many conversations we have these days that AI doesn't come up in one way, shape, or another. So when you say agentic storefront, I was on your website, downloaded some of your thought leadership pieces. What do you actually mean? I mean, it's a very fungible term these days. Everything from a basic chatbot all the way to something way more
Sure.
sophisticated. Talk about your application and how you think of it.
I think there are agentic applications across the entire ecom lifecycle, specifically to storefront. The difference here, a chatbot is there to answer questions. An agent, right, is there to actually complete the sale. So we're not adding AI to a website, right? That is an option, but we're actually encouraging you should replace the entire website. And I would geek out a little bit, from my former full-time venture capital years. This concept of having software do this job of your agent, right? Sales agent, customer support agent, whatever that was, right? That's not new, right? There were companies that launched with that mission 20 years ago. the tech is finally here that makes it possible, right? That's really the big shift here. That last piece, though, the tech is here. That doesn't mean that you have to outsource it to the big tech companies, right? I shouldn't have to give away control, give all my data and everything else so that the sale is happening somewhere else. You should still be able to deliver that experience, right, in a tailored way that is agentic. If we drop that term, that buzzword, and just call it conversational, right? You can do that now, even as a small brand, and maintain a real dialogue and conversation with your customer in a way that you control, as opposed to handing it off to one of the big tech companies.
It's really interesting, this evolution. I mean, I see parallels in early days. Jim and I got to know each other very well over very, very early days in e-commerce, where, it would take $1 million to take a credit card online. And then the platforms came along and it kind of leveled the playing field a little bit. I think that's what you're describing is you can be enterprises of all different types of scale and have access to this technology. Does that ring true for you?
I think it does, right? Even before it took you $1 million to get the credit card, mechanism set up, just to get the website set up, right? It cost you more a chunk of change. You had to go rack and stack servers, right? So we're seeing this ease of use, access to smaller providers and merchants, right? That's the constant here, and that's happening with this next generation of technology.
Let's change the lens a little bit. Tell us how this works through the shopper side. So if I'm shopping and one of your clients is putting forward your solution, what does it feel like? What is that experience for the customer versus let's call it a normal website visit? Can you share any clients CX success stories? We know how important it is for concluding closing the sale.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I might place this in context a little bit. For some of us, I think everybody on this call who's been in tech or doing e-com, for a very long time. Now, I'll make an assertion actually first before we talk about the latest changes, and I would assert that up until this year, the buying experience online is not different, and I don't mean in the last 20 years. I mean, we've taken the Sears Roebuck catalog from 1888 or whatever, and we put it online.
Right.
And now I've got, I can see all the variants with some digitized pictures of an even thicker catalog, or I can do a search to go find the variant. But I would argue that fundamentally, the only thing that's happened in the last 20 years is all of these efforts to squeeze out the next little bit. The thing I guarantee that everybody has gotten is technological complexity in trying to vend out that catalog. So talking about what's different from a customer experience standpoint, this is brand new, right? We just went generally available 6 weeks ago. We did the airmail brand in residence, both in London and New York. Some of our launch partners were, Skimkai and Retrofit. And I would say that overall, the customer experience is the difference between wandering through the catalog or digitally, clicking around the catalog alone through menus, versus as a brand having your best sales associate ever, walk the floor, right? Walk the digital room with you, right? And that can be text, that can be voice, right? That can be video with live try-on to check out the outfit. And the results that we're seeing are, 2x lift in conversion. I mean, these are some really wild numbers. 3x more time on site and a double-digit reduction in returns.
This question might be best asked in a few months from now when you actually gather more data, but it's kind of sticking with the how consumer behavior or shopper behavior is changing. So far, what does your data, tell us about how consumer behavior is changing, when it comes to using agents? I think obviously the big debate here in terms of, how far will we allow those agents to transact on our behalf? But what are some of the signs that you guys are seeing, from your own data?
Yeah, I would say the big thing that we're seeing from a discovery standpoint, starting at the top of the funnel here, is really geo impact. And it's interesting, right, that the generative engine optimization has adopted geo, because we think that there's discovery opportunities both at the AI LLM discovery end of the funnel, and on a geographic basis, right? There is global demand for many of the brands out there. If you've got a unique story to tell from a branding standpoint, you've got unique product, there is absolutely global demand for it. And it is being discovered now, plus or minus depending upon the brand or category that's being people are looking for assistance on. North of 50% of shoppers now are using AI or LLMs, right? One of these other tools to help them with the discovery decision. The thing that's really important, we think from a buying experience standpoint, is that really similar to the last generation of technology, right, with just the search bar, that traffic from a conversion standpoint is still happening in a merchant controlled environment, which we think is a really good thing from an overall customer experience standpoint.
Yeah, certainly some of the more recent data that I've seen, I think the big thing for I think anyone kind of to keep in mind, is the steepness of that adoption curve, right? I mean, what we're seeing, with consumers, embracing the LLMs and particularly so, it feels like on the as you say the top of the funnel kind of discovery, piece. I think that's where to be determined, I guess, as we kind of move further, down the funnel. Um, Webb, let's just kind of talk a little bit bigger picture here. With given your background, with you came from Avalara, you've got this rich history of working with high growth, technology companies. We've seen over the years with the cross border e-commerce space, as it has evolved from to what it is, today. The solutions that are out there can be point solutions are quite broad and menu like. You want to just talk about what does Swap bring to that merchant that is kind of a more comprehensive solution.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the way I would sort of describe this progression, earlier in my career, I learned that compliance was hard, and that was a great problem for tech to go solve. Right there was a lot of value there. A little bit as described before, people didn't want to have to deal with that international complexity. It was why would I invite that pain and burden, to myself? And that intimidation of compliance, I think for a long time was really where global expansion went to die. At Swap, what we've actually done is make this a part of it of the experience that you never have to think about, right? This setup is really obsessed with the customer experience, so that it feels local. The one that I would share with, it's actually a story from a different software company. I spent a lot of time at Qualtrics, and we actually had a whole project where we really focused on Operation Ugly Foreigner. And Operation Ugly Foreigner was about us, in this case, as an American brand, selling software in other geographies. And so whether it was bits or atoms that we were shipping out, right, to the rest of the world, how could we make sure that we showed up and felt local, right? Like we felt like we belonged there. We're operating in your language, in your country, in your currency. And that's the part where all of this complexity right now, a Swap and an e-com business, is not something you have to think about or be aware of or do research on, right? We'll put our neck out on the line and just take care of it for you.
It's a great message to have, certainly at a point in time that, at least from our perspective, where we see a lot of especially the mature global brands, they've got this increasing degree of complexity to all their go-to-market, revenue channels, especially when you start comparing, one region of the world, to another. So having that kind of, flexibility to really, manage all these, different channels, I think is really going to become the secret sauce, for a lot of these brands. And these are some of the issues that we as a community are trying to tackle, just because we see this complexity rising, and yet we know that there's some good solutions out there, right? That's exactly why we're trying to encourage more of this kind of peer-to-peer learning amongst the Guelph community.
Last question. Last question for me, Webb. Looking ahead, short term, long term. You talked about geeking out on the technology. Jim talks about complexity. Put those two together, and you got regulations, global regulations, and a pretty dynamic regulatory framework changing, looming changes. We've seen the removal of de minimis, EU changes coming up. How do you think about these changes and absorb them in? And what's your advice for the listeners, the retailers, and the brands listening about understanding and comprehending and following up on these regulatory changes?
Yeah, I got a couple maybe closing remarks. One, it's interesting we're having this conversation today, right? Tomorrow new fees go into effect in Europe. I think there is a lot of people out there, sort of in our industry, doing lots of educational material. You need to be aware of this, know what's going on for that. And I would say, as a headline, when you're working with Swap, you don't need to know or care about any of those things, right? Like don't worry about it. If you miss something, or someone got it wrong, or tariffs change on Tuesday, we've literally made the guarantee, and it's on us. So as a next step for things to go think about, global, don't boil the ocean. Pick a market that you were scared of historically to launch. We can get you live, in 30 days, depending upon the size and complexity, and let the results really guide your next decision on the global front. On agentic, it's not a buzzword, right? It's already having discovery and conversion impact to your business. And you can do all of these things running a global business in an agentic way and still maintain control as a merchant of that long-term customer experience you're trying to build.
It's a great vision, I think it comes at a very important, time for our industry, overall. Um, are there any other predictions, forecasts that you might want to share in terms of how do you see the next few years kind of, unfolding? Obviously, it's been a very tough, couple of years on the global trade front, in general. And what are you saying to a merchant, a retailer who, and I'm going to say, it isn't just starting, but they've been dabblers internationally in the past, right? I think that we know a lot of those kind of companies that have just done something very simple, and it's not a very elegant solution, not a very good customer experience. What do you tell those dabblers? How do they really level up their game?
For the predictions for the future, right, side of things, first, I'd say, change is the only constant, is the old adage, right? That didn't used to necessarily be true for many years for international, compliance challenges. There were rule changes, but the pace sort of matched the pace of the ships on the sea. That pace has changed. If the rates go up or down, right, the concern now is that change and uncertainty is the constant. And then from a dabbler's experience, from a customer, experience standpoint, again, that's the lens that we look at all of this through. If you're dabbling and you're doing it in a way that creates surprises, right, those are long-term damaging relationships, right? So if a customer is buying at a place where they expect everything to be price inclusive, right, are you delivering against that customer expectation? And if you're not, right, again, there are very easy solutions out there today where you can meet a local customer's experience, feel local, deliver local, and not have surprises that yield situations you want to avoid, of somebody not just being, on the Qualtrics side, I used to be selling the CX business, right? We think about the net promoter score, right? You don't want one of those experiences as you're dabbling to then lead to a detractor. Look at this always through the lens of the customer experience. And if you're obsessed about that, you're going to build a great business.
Very good words to end on. So again, Webb, thank you very much, for being a guest on the Global E-commerce Leaders Forum podcast. Where can people find you? Are you a LinkedIn guy?
I am on LinkedIn. You can definitely find me there.
Webb, thank you again, very much, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate the time.